Hello, everyone, and welcome to the InTeGrate Professional Development Webinar Series. The InTeGrate project aims to promote faculty teaching about the Earth in the context of society. InTeGrate is an NSF-funded STEM talent expansion project. Its two overarching goals are first, to develop materials and curricula that are adaptable for faculty to increase Earth literacy for all undergraduates. And second, to increase majors in the geosciences and related fields to develop a workforce capable of tackling environmental and resource challenges. This webinar is part of a series supporting teaching with InTeGrate principles, using the piloted and peer-reviewed InTeGrate developed and curated materials as tools. On the screen and on the next slide and in the chat box, you'll find a link to the webinar event page where you can find the presentation slides, resources related to the presentation, and afterwards a recording of the webinar. If you have questions along the way, you can type them into the chat box. To access that, find the Zoom control bar and click on chat. We ask that you leave your microphone muted and video off. These will help us get a good recording of today's webinar. Next slide. Today's webinar is also part of the NAGT webinar series, part of the On the Cutting Edge program. And we encourage you to check out the NAGT webinar page and see the other webinars in this semester's schedule. Before we get started, we have Lisa Gilbert here from the Earth Education for Sustainable Societies workshop. And I think she wanted to say a few things before we got started.
Thanks, Mitchell. Yeah, and just welcome to everybody. Thank you for participating in this webinar and to the next one, which is coming up October 1st. We really look forward to seeing you there and at the Earth Education for Sustainable Societies workshop in Minnesota in October. Thanks.
Thanks, Lisa. So with that, we'll dive into the webinar. Today, Earth Education for a Sustainable Future, supporting departments and programs through InTeGrate, will be presented by Ellen Iverson, Stephanie Sitt, and John McDarris, and I will turn it over to them.
Hi, everyone. This is Stephanie. We just wanted to do a brief introduction, put some faces to names. So here we all are. Mitchell, who's sort of leading us from CERC on the left, pictured on the left. Then myself, I'm from the University of Illinois at Chicago. John McDarris is also from CERC, and Ellen Iverson, also from the Science Education Resource Center.
Okay. Sorry, we had technical difficulties on our end. I'm Ellen Iverson, and as Stephanie said, I'm at the Science Education Resource Center at Carleton, and my role in the InTeGrate project had been, I was co-leading the assessment efforts, which were involved in both the materials development and implementation program, and also served as the internal evaluator on the project. Before I move forward, this is a slide that I did as of the registration on September 11th. We've had a number of people, we're up to 68 who had registered. And in terms of familiarity, I think this has shifted a little bit where we've had a few more people who are less familiar with InTeGrate who have registered. So what I wanted to do was just provide a high level perspective about InTeGrate. Since there's 2/3 of you who are pretty familiar with it, we won't spend a lot of time on this. As Mitchell pointed out to you, there are many resources on the website that can give you more information about InTeGrate. And as Lisa Gilbert pointed out, we'll have another webinar coming up on October 1st. So the InTeGrate project, as Mitchell mentioned, was funded as an NSF STEP Center, a STEM talent expansion program, supporting teaching of geoscience in the context of societal issues, both within geoscience courses and across the undergraduate curriculum. And the program itself operated on a number of interacting components and interdependencies. So on October 1st, you'll hear more about the materials development, including the InTeGrate guiding principles and the materials development rubric and those pieces. on the other side of it was the professional development, which is what you're participating in now. We've been having ongoing webinar series, as well as in-person workshops that have taken place since the start of the project. What we're going to be really focusing on today is the implementation programs. So the implementation programs are teams of educators who develop new models of ways to bring geoscience to a diverse range of disciplines, institutions, and networks. These program teams consisted of institutions or clusters of institutions. And what happened is they applied for grants to the program that were used to develop and evaluate these programs in innovative ways, increasing the diversity of students, developing Earth literacy, teaching students to bring geosciences to bear to address societal issues. The 16 teams that were selected to be part of the project all sought to use InTeGrate materials to affect changes on their campus or in their regions. So that's sort of what brought them together. These programs made use of and built upon the effective practices of InTeGrate. So in some cases, they extensively used the materials developed, the modules. In other cases, the modules inspired them to create their own materials, or some of the assessment practices, the materials development rubric, some of the instruments. They all had sort of their own take on how to situate the lessons learned from InTeGrate and the best practices of InTeGrate within their program. So they addressed a number of InTeGrate's goals, and I thought I'd touch on those. Before I give you a little bit more depth on this, I wanted to pose a question in the chat room. One, because we want to make sure the chat room that everyone's able to use the chat room, but also we're really curious as to, for those of you who are participating in the webinar, what are the goals as you look at this slide are you interested in addressing through your own work, either with programs or through your own teaching? And looking at the registration, I think some of you really have a program focus, and then others are thinking about their classroom or within their department. So if you could enter into the chat, if you've got some thoughts on that or questions related to that, that would be great. So as you look at the InTeGrate goals, as I mentioned, interdisciplinary was a big piece, but you can see some other things that are interesting that maybe you hadn't thought about with InTeGrate. One was that some of the programs you were used to introduce geoscience across the liberal arts curriculum really broadly. So we had one implementation program who was focused on trying to get climate change across their campus. So they had mini modules that were taught in religion courses, in physical education courses, so really thinking about the liberal learning. We had others, as you can see, these interinstitutional programs to get a sense of what that was like. We had a campus that had their graduate students become familiar with the InTeGrate curriculum and then co-teach at two-year colleges with the instructor of record, that gave the graduate students this teaching practice. It broadened the reach of the InTeGrate materials, and it provided a really nice interinstitutional program. And then K-12 teachers were another source of interest. We want to train our next generation of teachers to know how to best help students learn about the Earth. And there was a program that really looked across a large region at how to do this better. So that gives you sort of a sense as you see some of how InTeGrate's goals might interface. And the scales of impact were really from the program level, the institution level, clusters of several institutions, or the entire state, which is Washington State, and that was the one I alluded to in terms of teacher preparation. So you can see from the scale of impact and how these 16 institutions really stretched across this. Now I'd like to turn it over to John McDerris. He's going to be sharing with you more about the specific lessons learned and how they sort of a synthesis across these 16 programs.
Hello, everyone. So each of the implementation programs through InTeGrate, as a part of what they did, we tasked them with documenting their goals, their activities, the outcomes, all that kind of information on the website. These program descriptions are made up of multiple pages that lay out all the things that they did, all the things they hoped to do, and what they saw as the impacts of their work, as a way for giving advice to other people who wanted to make similar changes in their own contexts. Beyond the value of making these changes at the particular institutions, the experiences are a kind of field guide for others to follow. And even though no two contexts are exactly the same, these models provide some really important benefits to other people trying to work on the same kinds of issues on their own institutional, in their own institutions. Next slide. So each, as Ellen showed you earlier, the goals of each team were different, but they often covered a lot of the same ground. Maybe they were working on similar goals in different combinations across these different contexts. So one of the things we wanted to do was to get those teams together and learn what they saw as lessons across all the different teams. So we late in their work, we got them together at Carleton College for a workshop to really think about what are those big pools of lessons that we've learned. And specifically, a number of things jumped out based on the goals that they were trying to achieve. How can we attract and support diverse learners? How can we teach Earth across the whole curriculum? How can we build connections to strengthen K-12 teaching? How can we support transitions, including into the workforce, between institutional transfer and into more broadly into geoscience careers? And how can we make change happen at a large scale? So we tasked them all with thinking about what they did, reading each other's program descriptions, and picking apart some of these large things that either came up repeatedly across multiple teams' efforts, or that one team came up with a new and innovative solution that they maybe wanted to implement in another way. Next slide. So these next few slides are going to be just going through some of these high-level things and showing you just as examples. The images on the left are showing you the teams that were really focused on this particular aspect of their work. And on the right, you'll see a number of sort of high-level sub-topics underneath this each broad theme. So for attracting and supporting diverse learners, you can see that many teams found that demonstrating cultural relevance, generating community involvement, and collaborating with other institutions were key things. And there were different examples of each of those three things that they wrote about, and then focused back onto the program descriptions themselves to provide specific examples of how you move from this large-scale topic down to the ground level at a particular institution. So that's one of the important things about these synthesis pages, is that they are based on the direct experiences of these teams, and that provides some ground truth to what they're saying they learned. Next slide. Similarly, in teaching across the curriculum, you can see they found it very necessary to build interdisciplinary networks, developing curricula that were interdisciplinary as well, thinking about how you foster the institutional change necessary to allow teaching Earth across the curriculum, and the need to get students engaged in active learning. Next slide. K-12 is obviously very important, especially with the advent of the next generation science standards. So the teams that were interested in the K-12 teaching aspect really focused on using earth science topics as themes across the curriculum, not just in a physical science or earth science class, collaborating broadly and deeply with local teachers, with schools and departments of education within their own institution, as well as with local two-year colleges. And thinking about how do you plan at a scale that you can actually work at. There are different levels that you can be active at, from the entire state, as in the Washington state team, down to working with just a few K-12 teachers in your local area. Next slide. Support for transitions to the workforce, transfer, and careers. They focused on where the support for those transitions happens, and where you can provide the necessary support for students who are going through some of these transitions. There are things that individual faculty member can do at the course level. There are things that groups of faculty or whole departments or programs can do at that level to strengthen those ties. And at the institutional level, there are things to draw multiple institutions together such that the students feel supported across the entirety of the transition, whatever that transition is. Next slide. So the last part of the synthesis was something that was a little different. Given the nature of the program, every team had experience making change happen at their institution or in their group of institutions. So they all had something to say about how they did that. Were they able to make changes that they think will stick? How did they go about doing what they did? So we actually tasked all of the teams to think about this large topic, and everyone had a chance to contribute their ideas to giving advice to others who want to do this. So definitely thinking about how you design for maximum impact, supporting the implementation of change, not just thinking about what change you want, but how are you going to support the implementation of that change? How can you sustain that change and scale it up? Thinking about not just making a change that will go away as soon as that faculty member leaves or goes on to another position, but how can you institutionalize some of these things such that they have longer, broader impact? And how can you connect Earth and societal issues? Why is that important? How can that be a motivational and unifying focus across multiple disciplines? And how that can provide a lever to increase your reach. I think I'll pass it back to Ellen now for continuing on into some how we knew about the changes that these programs were making.
Sure. It looks like we have a question. What kind of change are we talking about? Change in programming or impacting the community in terms of sustainability?
That's yes. So there were some programs that were very focused on how can we do our job better teaching about the Earth and sustainability. And a number of the teams got their students out into the community to do service projects or learn about the effects of Earth science on their local communities and how to better help those communities be resilient in the face of climate change and other societal issues.
So John, if the it looks like that question came from Sarah, if she were to go looking at the InTeGrate website to get a little bit more in-depth understanding of what you just addressed, are there specific programs that she should look at? Like is Wittenberg one that she should take a look at? Or
yeah, Wittenberg is definitely one. Claflin is also it's a HBCU, and they were very interested in helping their communities be more resilient. So those two right off the top of my head would be great places to look.
Good, great. I'm going to move on and share with you a little bit about how InTeGrate as a project started to look at what the impact was on the faculty that were engaged in implementation programs, and a little bit how we understood the reach. So we had a number of different methods that we used to try to gauge the impact. We had a faculty survey that many of the implementation programs chose to offer. We conducted what we called reach surveys, where we annually or twice a year in the peak of things reached out to those who were participating to gauge a better understanding of what they thought the impact was. We had a qualitative study. Some of you might be familiar with Earth Educators Rendezvous meeting. Some of the workshops that were at Rendezvous were sponsored by InTeGrate, so we looked at what people were getting from that experience, as well as InTeGrate helped fund some of the early years for Earth Educators Rendezvous. And then the last piece is that some of you may have participated. We run a National Geoscience Faculty Survey 4 different times. The most recent time was in 2016. So the first 3 items, I'm going to just give you a sense of what the findings were, what we started to learn, and hope that you can think about as you're starting to think about changings in shaping a program, what you might think of in terms of evaluation or research or reach of how are you going to know that you've been successful. Okay. Great. So first, what I'm sharing with you is from the implementation programs, one measure that we looked at were kind of how many students we had a sense of might be impacted by some of the themes that John touched on. So for some of the implementation programs, they were able to provide us specific for courses, how many students were enrolled in those courses, where they identified specific courses that changed. This, not all the implementation programs were working at a course scale, so this doesn't represent the full reach of how students were touched upon, but it gave us a gauge as to, with these themes, what was the sense of the touching on students. So teacher preparation, for example, is something that would be way under reported, because a large scale teacher preparation program was across the state of Washington, and they were really looking at changing faculty and not looking at the courses in specific. So it's one measure. It's not necessarily the only measure, but it gave us a sense of, like when I looked in the chat, many of you were interested in broadening access as a goal for your program, and you can see that many of the programs were able to provide us data at the course level of how many students were involved. So you can get a sense of that. Another way that we looked at how to gauge impact was at the individual faculty that were participating either in an implementation program, and we asked the same set of questions for module authors, those that were developing the materials. Because we were really interested in, we knew those who were engaged in developing the materials, that we had a sense of some of the influence that experience was getting because we were interacting with them frequently. And the implementation programs were one set removed from us, and we wanted to gauge how that experience was influencing them. So as you can see, the blue being module authors, the red being implementation program members, that they reported similar types of influences. You can see where the pedagogical strategies and ways to think about student learning were reported at a higher level with the materials developers, but that was certainly not absent with implementation program. And partly it's because each of the programs had a little bit different bent and a little different goal. The other thing we looked at is we were looking at the interactions related to teaching, and this is something that was of interest on the implementation program leaders. And one of the things they were trying to do with some of the activities, whether it's faculty learning circles or professional development lunches or some other means of spreading the word, is that they did find that the implementation program members actually reported at a more frequent level than module authors, that the InTeGrate program really engaged them in thinking and talking with others at their own institution or with others in their own departments about teaching, and collaborating with others about teaching was heavier in the module authors, but you can see the engagement is more frequently reported by the materials, the implementation program. And when I delved into analyzing this sort of open-ended responses, one of the benefits of that was the interdisciplinarity of those dialogues. So we would hear from implementation program participants who were science faculty saying, how eye-opening it was to work with somebody in a different discipline to think about these problems, and vice versa, where those in the social sciences or humanities, it opened their eyes into how their science faculty were thinking about these same sort of interdisciplinary problems. And that was of high interest to the program leaders and was certainly reported by the participants. So that might be something you want to consider when you think about how to impact faculty. The other piece we did was a qualitative study where we interviewed faculty that were involved in implementation programs, materials developers, as well as some of the in-person workshops. And we were looking at those interviews, which happened 2 to 5 years after their involvement. And we also looked at the surveys that happened right at the time of their involvement. And looking at that, we kind of came away with 3 lessons. One, we learned the materials developers, and you'll hear more on October 1st about the materials. Over time, they reported high value in their teaching collaborations that emerge from the discourse with other disciplines. And as you saw, the implementation program people reported that right immediately following their participation, whereas that hadn't been reported as high with material developers, but in the interviews, that was something that came to be. The second thing was that this is sort of a tantalizing finding, but we don't have enough information, but it revealed a potential interaction between active learning techniques and sustainability curriculum. And this is of interest because potentially you're interested in one of your goals in developing some curriculum that's furthering sustainability on your campus and learning, student learning, and that we found those who had already had some experience with active learning, that the sustainability type curriculum was a nice, an easy on-ramp for them because they were familiar with this pedagogy. And the other way, where they might be more familiar with sustainability from a content standpoint, less familiar with active learning, that again, it was an easier on-ramp. We don't, as I said, this is too small to study, but that was of interest for those in the future. The third lesson that we took away was that the faculty in these implementation programs and those that participated in workshops reported that the InTeGrate principles promoted building competencies and connecting science and societal issues. And so when I would encourage you to listen in on the October 1st webinar, because they'll be talking more about the materials development, and that was really foundational of these guiding principles, looking at grand challenges, using data, systems thinking, interdisciplinarity, the sort of quantitative skills that were needed. So with that, I want to turn this over to Stephanie, because she's going to tell you a little bit more about how InTeGrate was then incorporated into the NAGT Traveling Workshop Program. And that might give you some other ideas of how you could think about it at the program or a teaching level.
Hi everyone, this is Stephanie here. And again, I'm from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and I'm coming at this with two different hats. One is I was part of an implementation program team at my institution. And then the second is that I'm also a facilitator with the NAGT Traveling Workshop Program. And the TWP brings national leaders in environmental sustainability and geoscience education to either your institution, sometimes your region, or it can be at a national event or conference. And so a lot of the lessons learned and the goals of the InTeGrate project are sort of woven into different themes and sessions that are available through these workshops. Typically, the workshops can be anywhere between 1 to 2 days. Sometimes if it's at a national event like a AGU or GSA, it could just be a half-day workshop that's more focused and concentrated. Next slide. So the TWP leaders, I have some of them just pictured on the left here, but our group is about 50 different leaders representing different fields and institutions. And working with this group, I've learned a lot. I was sort of trained as a more traditional geologist, but I've been able to interact with people who are have a geography background or more of a sustainability background, and even some folks that are in the humanities or political science. So it's been a really enjoyable experience for me to learn from them about how they incorporate geoscience, sustainability, and environmental topics in their courses. Overarching, we have different workshop themes, and that includes sort of building stronger geoscience and environmental science departments and programs. 2, strengthening cross-campus environmental and sustainability programs. 3, strengthening earth science teacher education. Supporting the success of all students. The fifth and sixth sort of workshop themes focus on different courses. So either strengthening your intro or upper division courses or making your courses more effective and socially relevant. And previously, Ellen had talked about those different sort of lessons learned from InTeGrate, that there's high value in teaching collaborations. And this is sort of a focus of sort of some of the building stronger departments and program workshops, and also developing cross-campus environmental and sustainability programs. Some of the active learning techniques and sustainability curriculum is also focused on in other themes like strengthening earth science teacher education, supporting the success of all students, and then the different course level workshops as well. And then sort of the last lesson that Alan talked about was InTeGrate principles promoted building competencies in connecting science and societal issues. Again, this can be sort of woven throughout of not only sort of attracting students into the discipline, but creating more relevant and engaging courses as well. Next slide. So within a traveling workshop program, there's a 1 to 2 day workshop that I talked about, but typically you can choose 4 to 6 various sessions. And so I just pulled out a few different session titles that we have and here, but it can be anything from increasing the diversity of your majors to assessing learning and programs. We can even talk about metacognition, motivation, and the affective domain. But I've chosen a few just to focus on. And in the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit more about them. So if you were able to have a TWP workshop at your institution and chose sort of the embedding sustainability in your programs session, the leaders work to identify institutional context, sort of existing opportunities for sustainability programs at your institution, and then also potential partners. Potential focus areas are developing curriculum or co-curricular activities, or even campus-wide initiatives. Additionally, one of the other InTeGrate goals was to focus on careers. And again, TWP offers a specific session on preparing students for careers from day one. So we often do an exercise that allows faculty to explore ways to obtain feedback about career preparation from employers and graduates, and then provide an action plan to develop more effective curriculum and departmental activities to better prepare students for employment opportunities. On the next slide, I pulled out 2 other sessions that might be of interest to this audience and sort of align with some of the InTeGrate goals that we've been discussing. One is increasing the diversity of your majors. And so through our program, we're able to, we sort of have institutions or departments analyze different student demographic data and compare either your introductory course to who you're attracting in your introductory courses compared to your institution as a whole. And then also tracking data of who's declaring a major or what the retention and graduation rates look like for different demographic groups. Our group will also help you examine challenges that students face in their program and potential barriers. And we'll help you formulate and realign diversity goals and assess measurable outcomes. A 4th session that I wanted to highlight was course design. And so from InTeGrate, we've learned a lot about teaching pedagogy and also how those pedagogies can be implemented at different institutions, whether it's a community college, a small liberal arts college, or a large research institution. And so oftentimes we use a backwards course design to help faculty articulate goals for student learning, assessment of learning, and also designing instructional activities. We'll often go through and highlight different InTeGrate modules to show examples of good pedagogy. And also, I think another important thing about the InTeGrate modules is the sort of institutional implementation, the sort of story of how it was implemented in different settings. So with that, I think we sort of are done with the formal part of our presentation. We wanted to leave a lot of time for questions and want to hear from you and things that you're interested in and where you're coming from. So please feel free to write any questions that you might have in the chat. We'll just check in with the group as a whole.
While you're thinking about what questions you have, when I was looking at your responses about the goals, many of you had put broadening participation. And I know that Stephanie touched a little bit on how the TWP looks at what are some of the strategies that they've used on their sessions for increasing the diversity of the majors. And then John touched on a little bit about some of the programs that focused on broadening participation. I'm curious as to if you have some follow-up questions after hearing sort of these high-level touching on that. If you have more specifics that you're thinking about with those goals, we would be happy to provide more about the lessons learned. So that would be something else if you had questions about in the chat.
And I appreciate, this is Stephanie again. I have some other TWP leaders and facilitators on this webinar, and I know David is helping answer questions about the TWP.
So one of the questions that came through the chat is, what are the future goals for InTeGrate, additional modules, implementation programs, TWP? I think that Lisa could talk a little bit about the follow-on workshop that's happening in October and what might people that are engaged in that, they might be thinking, because that's one of the launch pads for the future for InTeGrate. Lisa, are you available? That could maybe give us a little bit on that.
Yeah, thanks, Ellen. Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that's very much one of the goals of our workshop coming up, Earth Education for a Sustainable Future, is to be thinking about not just what we can learn from the many successful elements of InTeGrate, but also all the ways in which we need to be thinking about how education about the Earth can be more accessible to more, and also getting at another question I see in here too, sort of integrated into the way that we think about approaching big scale problems. And so that includes informal education, high school, higher education, all the ways in which people access information about the Earth in many different modes. And that's one of the things we're really excited to talk about at the workshop, with people representing a lot of those groups and some others as well. So that's very much, NSF is excited to also sort of help support us thinking very big about moving beyond what was InTeGrate was very much focused on undergraduates, not entirely, but very much focused on undergraduates, and sort of thinking even bigger about Earth education.
Great, thanks, Lisa. We have another question about does the organization help with the perception that earth science is the non-college track in the high school, at least where I live? So InTeGrate as a whole hasn't addressed that. I don't know as much about the Washington State implementation program. May have been looking at that because they were really focused more on the bridge between InTeGrate and the K-12 world. I know that there's other projects at the national scale that are starting to look at that bridge, but I think that that could certainly be a future area. But I don't know if, John, if you can talk a little bit more about what the Washington State group has done.
I haven't kept up with their recent work. They went on to get another round of funding to continue the work they started as an implementation program. But they were really focused around how to provide teacher training for those who are going to end up teaching earth science in the K-12 realm. And so they were looking at statewide, how does Washington State change to actually produce teachers who are capable and competent in teaching earth science. You're right, you're absolutely right. Nationwide, earth science is seen as the science class for students who don't do science. That perception is changing in some quarters, but is changing slowly. And there are a lot of groups who are out there working on that, trying to demonstrate how earth science is really a capstone experience for pulling together all the chemistry, physics, biology, all the other sciences. You can naturally look at the earth system as sort of rolling all of those up into one package, as it were. So there are groups working on that, but it's very much still a perception issue that we're facing in the earth sciences, that we're seen as less than or not as rigorous or what have you as some of the other sciences. But no, it's definitely something that people are working on.
Yeah, and this is Stephanie again. I'll just add a couple things to note about sort of high school programs. And one, I think InTeGrate really focuses on working outside of your institution and either in the community, which can help raise the elevation of the geosciences, and also sort of getting other disciplines like chemistry and physics to incorporate a little bit of geoscience within their curriculum as well. I know one thing that my institution is doing is through an NSF GeoPaths project is actually creating a college credit course for high school students. It's a dual enrollment course that high school students can take that is geoscience focused, and they come to campus to earn college credit. So we're just trying to raise that and elevate the perception of geoscience, but it's certainly a difficult challenge, and we're making slow progress.
So there was another question from Kim Castens about if anyone had further thoughts about how programs can assess to what extent students and graduates are going on to use what they learned about the Earth to increase environmental sustainability through their decisions in personal or professional lives. So I don't know, Stephanie or John, if you're aware of any of the implementation programs that we're looking at that sort of either alumni survey or a more longitudinal survey with students. The InTeGrate program itself collected data about students, as Kim knows, at the course level, but I wasn't sure if either one of you had any insights as to if any of the implementation programs were grappling with this sort of how does that sustain or influence students' later learning or decision making.
I don't know of anybody who is actively grappling with that. Obviously, they were hoping that that would be the case, and I think many teams were just simply trying to get to the point where they could think that maybe they would do that. But I don't have any specifics. Maybe somebody else does.
And then another question is, to what extent have the InTeGrate implementation groups tied what they teach to addressing the local impacts of climate change on the environment and society in a way of making it more relevant to the students? And I know, Stephanie, you touched a little bit on your experience with the traveling workshop is that some of the campuses are really looking at being able to do that in the community, and that was one way to sort of raise the profile of learning about the earth. John, do you have some other thoughts of some of the ones that have really engaged from a community standpoint?
Right off the top of my head, there were thinking about how they taught those, or what they taught. I actually don't have my hand on a good example of that right
Like
now.
I was thinking of some of the work that Wittenberg did might be useful, because I know that they were had different ways of engaging the community and specific organizations that they reached out to within their community, and being a smaller college in a smaller community, that they had some advantages of having those relationships. But that would be one of the ones that I would think that would be a nice model to look at.
And as Kathy put into the chat box, the Savannah State group were very outward focused in that way as well, and got their students out to do really interesting service projects in the community.
Kim Castens has some additional information that she said she could share about the webinar coming up.
Thanks, Ellen. This is Kim. I'm one of the facilitators for the October 1st webinar, along with Ann Egger. And I just wanted to say what the intent is for that webinar. So InTeGrate tackled Earth education at 2 scales. You've been hearing about the program and larger scale. The second webinar is about the scale of individual teaching modules within individual courses. And it will begin with Ann talking about how the materials development process happened, and in particular, what kinds of checks and balances InTeGrate built into the system to nudge the materials towards high quality materials, kinds of checks and balances that you might want to include if you were developing your own materials development program. Then I'll talk about what did InTeGrate do to try to figure out whether or not, or figure out to what extent the materials that were developed in the program were indeed being effective as far as both impact on faculty using them and on students using them, similar to what Ellen did today. Then Anne will review gaps that still exist in the portfolio of materials. So there, InTeGrate's portfolio of materials is very broad on many dimensions, but there are some dimensions that were not as thoroughly addressed as others, and they represent opportunities for upcoming programs. And then finally, I will talk about a few large-scale lessons learned that you might think of as answers to the question of, well, why did InTeGrate actually work? What was the secret sauce that made that work? And I have a few thoughts on that will conclude the webinar. So we hope to hear many of you there, see many of you there.
Thank you, Kim. I think that's really helpful in terms of the people understanding a little bit about what they can expect from the next webinar and how it ties in. One of the things that isn't a question, but I thought might be something worth Stephanie addressing, is that David had put in the chat that one of the key elements of the TWP is an action plan for the department or the program to improve its student-centered goals. And I wondered, Stephanie, if you could talk a little bit about what sort of either the action plan piece, or if there's some strategies coming out of TWP that folks on this webinar might be interested in, that would be either engaging in becoming a applicant for the TWP, or thinking about how they could do it in their own department. And it seems like if you could just touch on what that means by, you know, an outcome as an action plan, what does that action plan look like?
Yeah, so I think what leaders have found in the past is it's great to get a lot of information about either pedagogies or hearing about how to increase diversity, but faculty and administrators are very busy, and so we try to be very specific and with the time during the workshop to set aside time for action planning. And so just to help create some momentum for participants to really figure out, you know, either who they need to connect with, or, you know, what they plan to do, you know, either the first week or by the end of the semester. And so the action plan is developed throughout the workshop, either like in a courses workshop. It might be first, you know, looking through your syllabus and seeing what policies you have and where you can fit in a different teaching activity, or where you might want to bring in other speakers or alumni. For sort of larger departmental or programs workshop, this is where it's nice to have outside facilitators to give you a different perspective and a sort of objective perspective on creating a more coherent department. And different activities, action plans that they might focus on are sort of developing stronger alumni relations as a whole, or potentially changing different course or coursework or majors within a department. Potentially, if there's something that maybe David or Walt want to add about the action plan, please feel free.
Well, this is Ellen. The one thing I guess I would add is that earlier in the model of the traveling workshop program, earlier when we looked at the evaluation of the action plan piece, those that were really critical in terms of thinking about what were going to be some of the barriers that might slow you down, and being really articulate about those, and that campuses that were able to do that, really think about knowing what the barriers might be, were able to move forward, that versus those who you had some strong action planning but didn't have a sense of what they might hit up against. So I think that was another really positive aspect of having that sort of focused action planning. Great, and you can see in the chat some more information. I guess I would like to have us move a little bit forward. What I'm going to say is that Mitchell has told me that the chat is going to be captured. So those that in the chat who said I have to hop off, I have students coming in or class. The questions that came up, I'll point out to you that Kathy Manduka pointed out NAGT as a resource, and that you'll see in terms of advocacy that there is some follow-up information if you're interested in that. To follow up on that, that's also in the chat, and the chat will be posted with the recorded webinar, so that if you didn't catch that flying by right now, you will certainly be able to come back and see it. So with that, I think we're going to move forward.
Thank you to everyone who was able to attend today. We hope that we'll be able to see you at one of our future webinars. Also, thank you to Ellen, John, and Stephanie, as well as Lisa, Kim, and everyone else who managed to chip in during today's webinar. Just a few more things before we go. Next slide. As we mentioned a couple times, we have another webinar coming up. This is part of the NAGT webinar series. Lessons learned from InTeGrate's materials development program and what remains undone, presented by Kim Castens and Ann Egger. This is Tuesday, October 1 at 2 Eastern. And you can see the link there. You can also get to this webinar event page through the InTeGrate webinar schedule. We have a couple other opportunities. You can apply for an NAGT Traveling Workshop. I think David put a link to that in the chat. The next deadline coming up is October 15th. And we also invite you to join us at the 2020 Earth Educators Rendezvous, which is going to be hosted at Stanford University in Palo Alto, California. Next slide. And finally, we always appreciate your feedback and ideas. In the chat, I've added a link to our webinar evaluation. If you have a few minutes after today's webinar, we'd really appreciate your feedback.
People really look at those surveys, so please consider filling it out.
And if you'd like to continue the discussion, we have a discussion board set up. You can follow that link and keep communicating with other people on this webinar about the things that you heard and ideas that you have. So again, thank you, Ellen, John, Stephanie, for giving a great webinar today. And to our audience, thanks for attending, and we hope to see you again soon.